Well, it really is an absolute joy to be talking to you tonight. As much as anything, because since I started talking about this book, started giving this particular talk, I've done it pretty much exclusively to non-mothers, would you believe? So with the exception of the Somerset Moth Group, it's mainly been to wildlife societies, natural history societies, even birding groups, local RSPB groups. So normally I'm trying to kind of persuade them of the joy of moths, but with you, I've got no such issues. It's you're converts already. Now I'm just trying to move the slide on. Right, it's also a really timely it's really timely to talk to you about moths for several reasons. In particular, connected with butterfly conservation, it's rather embarrassing to be mentioning Richard's employer when he was right in front of you as well. But I really sense that the zeitgeist of moths is now. So it started back in 2019 when the seminal Atlas of the Larger Moths Distribution and Abundance was published, a groundbreaking publication itself, but really came to the fore, I think, in the publication on the right this year, sort of setting out the status of moths, these larger moths in Britain. And that led to other things as well, notably a sort of reassessment of the conservation status of Britain's rarer moths. And in part of that, there's been a real surge detectable within butterfly conservation about moths. So BC has released its new strategy. Doubtless Richard was very much involved in its design. But throughout here, you can see butterflies and moths given level pegging. And that, is really pleasing to see as a mother. It may well be the first time it's happened, but it's very obvious. And that's really striking and really empowering. And all this has been possible, of course, because of the exponential surge in the interest in moths and mothing over the last years. I mean, even in the last few years that I've been mothing, there's been a huge increase in the number of people interested in moths. But for those of you who are wanting moths when I was probably in my nappies, the activity was probably quite a niche pursuit, and you must have witnessed really quite a remarkable change. And as I understand it, someone's trying to get in. As I understand it, your moth group is a case in point. Because what was it? Something like a 75% uptick in the number of records submitted to the Devon County Moth Recorder during 2020 compared to the year before. And that's been, as far as we can tell, that's a pattern nationwide. Not quite as much perhaps as in Devon, but really impressive. And also, during the COVID lockdown, that's when sort of wildlife watchers seem to kind of being forced to stay at home, sort of seem to congregate around the idea of moths and mothing. And retailers sold out moth traps. There's even a university moth challenge now. So really is the time of moths appears to be now. Sorry. So who am I? Richard gave you a brief introduction. I'm primarily a nature writer. I write about wildlife, conservation, and travel, generally in combination. I've written a number of books. I think the latest count is 13, most of them about the wildlife of Britain, but some about places further afield. 3 of them have won awards, one winning a Travel Guide Book of the Year award in 2016, another one winning a Travel Guide Book of the Year award in 2018. A book of butterflies won a gong in the US as well, which is very pleasing. And I've actually got 2 books about moths out this year. One is for people who are just coming into mothing in the first couple of years of mothing, a beginner's guide to moths, trying to get them to kind of go along the gateway, both into the world of moths, but also into those established field guides that we all know and love. And of course, Much Ado About Mothing, which, as Richard said, came out early in this year, just about late May. So it's just had its 4-month birthday. Anyway, more importantly, I'm going to talk to you about a particular day in my life. And I remember the date precisely because it was the 7th of July, 2012. And this was the day that my life changed forever. It wasn't the day I got married. That was pretty important. And nor was it the day that our darling baby daughter was born. But it did involve a female, just not a girl or a woman. She was arrestingly beautiful. She brought a wholly unexpected buckling of the knees, a really quite unanticipated thumping of the heart. And she was a moth. To be precise, she was a poplar hawk moth, a female, surprisingly, shown to me by a birdwatching mate called James Hunter, just before we went to go and see a rare orchid. She was sweetly furry. She was verging on velvety. She was gawkily angular. She was wrapped in silver and banded in bronze and grizzled with these wonderful iron filings. And she was gloriously placid. And she was huge, and she was glorious, and she was utterly wrong. Because moths, and I knew this for an absolute fact because I was an arrogant little tosser, were small, brown, and dull. Moths at best were uninteresting, and they were usually irritating. They were eerie creatures of the night, remaining invisible but destroying my suits nonetheless. They were malign phantoms from another realm. And I have to admit, for nearly 40 years of my life, I was among the many people, roughly 2/3 of Britons, who routinely slander all moths as being clothes-munching, plant-destroying pests. What a horrible word, pests. But this particular pork-pahawk moth, she opened my eyes, she brought me to my senses, and she revolutionized the way that I engage with nature. And 7 years later, moths hijacked my life. And the result is this book in particular, which is effectively, it's a year-long quest to celebrate Britain's rare and remarkable moth and bring them to the attention of the public. It's all about trying to challenge people's preconceptions, correct misunderstandings, rebooting our collective attitude to these creatures. It's for mothers as well. You will love it far more than the general public will. But I want to get some kind of messages across to a wider audience, or to wildlife watchers who haven't yet seen the light or the dark, whatever you want to call it. Because as you well know, moths. Sorry. Not quite sure how to know. Moths, they may be unseen by the general public, but they live everywhere. So from Cornwall right the way through to the Cairngorms, I spent the year of 2019 exploring British landscapes with that purpose of coaxing moths from out of the darkness and into the light, people keep coming in to the mating rooms. I'm sorry, my computer keeps on beeping at me. Trying to unveil these I think we'd all admit are underdogs of the animal kingdom, to be attractive, astonishing, and approachable. And with 2,500 species of moth, there's so many exciting tales to tell, from migratory feats. So no wonder birdwatchers are getting excited in moths when there's swarms of silver wires everywhere, to the mastery of camouflage. Who cannot be bewitched by such an enchanting creature as a merveille du jour? And then outlandish mimicry. And then the stories that moths tell are richer too. They reveal that they're sort of messengers, winged messages, revealing the true state of the planet. Moths are in decline, but there's also some increases going on, as the wonderful report that Richard was so involved in has told us. But there's also weirder stories too, sort of the service that moths provide to us via pollinating wild plants and agricultural crops. I think there's been 3 studies now in British landscapes that have shown up to 45% of moths carry pollen around our countryside. So our countryside wouldn't look like what it does without moths. And there's even weirder stuff too. So the possibility that moths have been helping in the fight against COVID, admittedly not a UK moth, a North American moth, and potentially even helping such things as solving the world's plastic problem by identifying a couple of species of caterpillars that can actually digest polyphenes. So hiking up mountains and wading through marshes and bivvying on heathlands and roaming by night amidst ancient woodlands and occasionally risking limb, if not life, and constantly on the move, travelling 14,000 miles during this year, exploring 139 locations across 27 counties over 258 days and nights. I followed the trails of both Victorian collectors and present-day conservationists. And my whole aim was to try and understand why environmentalists and many ordinary folk, you and me, alike, love what the general public says that it hates. And the whole investigations, they reveal this heady world of controversy and conservation, criminality, daring do, determination, all these wonderful alliterations. But as a counterweight to these quite intoxicating travels, my young daughter Maya and I, we tracked the seasons through a kaleidoscope of several hundred moth species that lived covertly in our suburban garden. Without a moth trap and a light, would never have been determined. So all of these, attracted to the absolutely bog standard, simple construction of a tub with a light on top, with a few egg boxes inside. How simple is that, and how joyous? So without even leaving home, my daughter and I managed to bond through this shared joy that we had in the uncommon beauty of what turned out to be really quite common creatures. For perhaps the greatest virtue of moths we came to surmise was their accessibility. You know, moths may be everywhere, but above all, they're here, living alongside us. And quite unexpectedly, I came to think, perhaps there are no animals better placed to inspire the environmentalists of the future. So what better way to spend the year of my life than exploring Britain seen through the filter of moths? Now, in this talk, I'm going to start with some of the greatest hits of garden mothing, if you like, because that's where we all start, isn't it? In COVID times more than ever. And then I'll go on to the travel dimension of the big moth year. And given that my daughter and I sort of recorded roughly 14,000 individuals of 460 odd species across 151 nights in our fairly nondescript suburban garden, there's plenty to choose from. And on each one of those 151 mornings, my daughter and I performed the much-loved ceremony of moth trapping, the one you're all familiar with, turning off the electricity at dawn, the nervous steps out to the trap, pots and notebook in hand, the careful removal of the bulb and the housing, the unveiling of the perspex lid that prevents the moths from escaping, and then your heart slightly pounding, sort of reverential examination of both sides of every egg tray before cataloguing every moth and releasing them safely in the undergrowth. It's sort of like, it's Christmas morning every time. You can see my daughter's writing here. She absolutely loved it. She even knows the acronyms. She's got H and D at the top, heart and dart. Fabulous. Anyway, as we got into spring, sort of the sort of a burgeoning variety of moth life, that's when it really kicks off. And that sort of provided this wonderful, rich vein of existence for my daughter and I to appreciate together and to ponder together. So each morning before breakfast, bubble wrap with birdsong, we'd be rifling through our egg trays, and the species we found sort of provide these strange stories of ecology and evolution, of conservation and camouflage that transported us through many a school run. And one example is the pale tussock. I mean, even in appearance, it's gorgeous, fluffily feline, luxuriating with its forelegs extended. But also, it helped us marvel at the ability of some moths to produce sound in flight and sort of advertise their distastefulness to bats. It's sort of this wonderful arms race between moths and bats, and the tussocks sort of got us talking about that. And then you got the shag pile furriness of a male muslin moth, which pleased us greatly. Me, because grayness aside, the kind of mad Professor Hare sort of reminds me of what I looked like in my 20s, kind of hair absolutely everywhere. So yeah, it's quite an amusing one for me, this one. And then there's moths such as the rather pumpkin seed shaped orange footman. And this is a moth that I'm sure you know has become a hundredfold commoner in roughly my lifetime. Benefiting from air quality improvements that help its the lichen on which caterpillars feed to flourish. And you can see that in an environment that's heaving with losers, the orange footman is definitely a winner. This is a map from Richard's publication earlier in the year showing that the amazing range expansion of this species. So definitely something to celebrate within our own garden. But then we gawped at moths as well. So gawping at a spectacle, how can you not? This kind of natty goth moth with this upstanding gingery pinkish Mohican, and when looked at front on with these wonderful John Lennon specs on what passes for its forehead. But it did prompt my daughter to say, Dada, that moth can't be real. I said, why not? Why not? Because its eyes are in the wrong place. So you can't win them all. And then someone else is trying to get in. Hang on. And then there's the peppered moth, of course. I mean, this is a world famous insect that we can find in our gardens. I learned about it in biology lessons, the two main colour forms, one, the white one predominating since the Industrial Revolution, the black one during the Industrial Revolution. All the kind of stories about how this was discovered and the backdrop of whether the science that went on was quite as rigorous as was claimed, but has now been proven. So there's a whole layer of intrigue as well as the pure natural selection story. But again, this is in our garden. And then the peppered moth starts piquing my daughter's interest in camouflaged insects. So through our garden, we investigate these creatures that go to quite remarkable lengths to elude detection by any range of moth munchers. So we find moths that look like leaves. You all know the angle shades, I'm sure, but isn't it such an Art Deco creation? It's an amazing creature. And from leaves, we move up tree to twigs, and we're trying to find a series of moths that compete for the accolade of best stick. So chamomile shark, not bad. Mullein moth, yeah, pretty damn good. But pale prominent, I mean, you show a pale prominent to a non-mother and they can't believe that that is a real creature. And they ask, what on earth is going on with its nose? And you have to explain it's not quite a nose, etc., etc. But isn't that remarkable? But still, this is only in silver position on our podium of stick-like moths, because how can there be a winner other than the buff tip? By dint of being buff at both tips, it's an amazing moth. If you found this in a tropical rainforest, you wouldn't be surprised. But this is in our gardens, and that's why moths are such a rich vein of existence to kind of communicate the joys of nature. But if you're a 9-year-old girl, as my daughter was at the time, most giggle-worthy of all are, of course, the bird poo moths. Splashes of black and white excrement hiding in plain sight. I mean, no blue tit's going to eat a great tit's dropping, is it? So they get through the day and get to fly another night. And there's obviously a whole range of these, including lime-spec pug and various bird poo tortrixes, micromoths as well. But we also catch insects that split family opinion. Remember, my daughter and wife don't really know much about moths, and it splits family opinion about whether these are butterflies or they're moths. The brimstone moth being one, and the early thorn being another, and that prompts a whole conversation about what differentiates butterflies from moths. And you know the answer, but it's an answer that distresses pretty much every moth hater around. Basically, there's not much in the way of difference. Taxonomically, most importantly, they're all scale-wing creatures, all in the order Lepidoptera, 6 butterfly families actually nestling within the 120-odd families of moths. And linguistically, it turns out English is quite an outlier in differentiating between moths, that horrible guttural sound, and butterflies with its connotations of beauty and heat and warmth and sun. But in French and in German and Dutch, you've basically got butterflies, papillon in French, and night butterflies, papillon de nuit. In German, it's Tagfalter, day flyers, and Nachtfalter, night flyers. In Dutch, it's the same, Vlinder and Nachtvlinder. So moths are simply butterflies with bad PR, or put another way, butterflies are simply lucky moths with good PR. And so with that in mind, one sort of balmy late March afternoon, Mara and I decided to entice into our garden. I said it wasn't much. It's not, it's a little piece of lawn and a few shrubs and the odd tree. We try and entice into our garden a day-flying moth that, in my view, being so glamorous of appearance and imperious of demeanour, sort of puts to shame pretty much every British butterfly. So the conditions are perfect for worshipping emperor moths, warm and sunny with a soft breeze. And we use the trick that you will all be familiar with, but comes as quite a shock to bird watchers, for example. I talked to them about it, hanging out a pheromone lure to find out whether there's an emperor moth in the vicinity. And sure enough, once a male catches the scent of this female on those full-sewn plumose antennae, he'll assume that an empress is calling her willingness to mate, and so he'll zigzag across the plume of scent, pinpointing the source and arrowing in towards it, perhaps from, as some people think, as much as a mile away. Or in this case, he arrows in towards us. So here he is, the emperor in all his glory. Talking of glory, it's mid-April and it's time to kick off on our travels. And in the wee hours of Good Friday, my wingman for the year, a friend called Will Saw, another friend, a medic, and we drive north all the way up to the eastern Scottish Highlands from my home in Norwich. And we'd actually planned to visit 10 days later, but February 2019 was really warm and that accelerated Scotland's spring. And it turned out that the principal objective for our trip, which was the one and only Kentish Glory, was already airborne. And it only flies for 3 weeks. So we had to panic, we rearranged our lives, we changed holidays, work shifts, and we powered north because there was no time to lose. And our trip north actually coincided with quite a worrisome announcement about Scottish moths. And this came from Butterfly Conservation Scotland, who had crunched a data set then of 5 million records, calculating that the abundance of Scottish moths had halved in the quarter century to 2014. Clearly, I think there's been a more refined analysis subsequently, certainly nationwide, but this was the one that was in our minds as we were driving up north. And some of the conclusions were really quite stark. So 10 times more species were significantly decreasing than significantly increasing. And those plummeting populations thought to be the result of habitat degradation, changes in land management, warmer, wetter winters, that type of thing. But Butterfly Conservation Scotland sort of softened the chastening with case studies on 5 moths for which conservation action was underway. And that quintet included Britain's most arresting moth, Kentish Glory, and that became a resonant headline, if you like, for our visit. This is a large, evolutionarily unique creature. It's the only member of its genus, but of course it remains Kentish in name alone, having dwindled to extinction in England in about 1970. Only clings on now in the Scottish Highlands, and here it's been benefiting from a project called the Rare Invertebrates in Cairngorms Project, a sort of mini-bee-centric partnership, if you would, between several environmental NGOs. And the project have been trialling a pheromone lure to properly help survey the moth's distribution. So, you know, like we use it for emperor moths, it was being used for Kentish Glory. And in the second season of the surveys, some 40 volunteers discovered 71 new sites for Kentish Glory, including 10 wholly new 10-kilometre squares. And clearly, knowing exactly where moths occur is critical for conservation, but it also helps, you know, wildlife organisations advise landowners about how to manage properties to benefit the moths. So it's now known, for example, that Kentish Glory lays eggs only on young birch below 2 metres in height. And so the key seems to be to sort of restore these dynamic connected ecosystems with regenerating woodland of different ages. And that's, you know, potentially quite good news, because the largest rewilding initiative in the UK is right here in the Cairngorms. It's a project called Cairngorms Connect. It's got this 200-year vision to sort of strategically manage 60,000 hectares, trying to return natural ecological processes to forests, to peatland, to floodplain. So there's some real potential here. And we contribute modestly to the survey. We hang out lures at a few places, getting some negatives and a few positives. And we run traps in one reserve near Braemar. And we do astonishingly well. So we lure 2 males, which was great. But in the course of 3 nights, we catch 25 adults, including 6 in this little portable actinic trap. And I can tell you, looking at these gorgeous faces peering up at me, when I took off the lid of the trap, was possibly one of the best moments of the entire year. I squealed with glory. I have to say. And just look at them. If you haven't seen Kentish Glory, do try and make the trip. I mean, the male's got these harps for antennae, which sort of pay testament to the importance of detecting female pheromones. And there's so much colour and pattern going on, sort of the ermine mantle of a High Court judge luxuriating sort of on a thorax. There's got a wonderful golden throw as well, sort of body of russet fur, and so much horse chestnut going on, and blizzards and snowflakes, and even, I reckon, a sort of a marker pen being held by a child's hand juddering its way across the wings. So majestic and magisterial. I think, you know, Kentish Glory is arguably Britain's most widely craved resident moth, and for good reason. I think it's a real stunner. So if you've not been up there, please do. Anyhow, no 2 ways about it. Hawk moths are the poster boys and girls of the moth world. And given it was one of their number that seduced me to the dark side, how could I not devote quite a chunk of the year to tracking down all the species that Britain has breeding? So I kicked off on a new build housing estate in Norfolk, quite an incongruous location, but I was there to interview a man who was obsessed with hawk moths, and particularly captive breeding hawk moths. And indeed, he had this sort of sisterhood of death's heads batting their way even around his kitchen. For something a little bit more wild, if you like, I headed to a Dorset Wildlife Trust reserve to understand how sympathetic land management is helping the narrow border bee hawk moth sort of resurge across parts of the county, and indeed more widely. You'll probably know this species. It's a mimic. Indeed, I reckon it makes trickery into an art form, being so gorgeously fuzzily plump with these transparent wings, diurnal activity, buzzing flight, taste for nectar. I mean, they're perfect mock bumblebees, aren't they? Later in that month, so we're in May at the moment, I joined author Patrick Barkham, who I'm sure many of you will know for having written the Butterfly Isles, gorgeous book, and his dad John, who was a retired academic. And we head off into the North Norfolk coast together in a dusk vigil. And here we're hoping to encounter a nationally threatened species that's thought to breed in pockets along the dunes and shingle. And as the gloaming encroached, we were absolutely overjoyed to run into 3 bedstraw hawk moths, sort of feeding on honeysuckle. Quite different to how you would see them in a moth trap. This was a proper field encounter, and all were these sort of hyperspeed streaks of rose and cream, refueling airily right in front of our faces. Absolutely splendid creatures. But this is how, if you were lucky enough to catch one in your moth trap, you would tend to see it. So obviously a far more sedate creature, but get out and enjoy these hawk moths doing what they do. It's wonderful. And on our bedstraw hawk moth John Barkham rejoiced in what he called the abundance and accessibility of many hawk moths. It's so pleasing, he said, that hawk moths are relatively common, so you can actually expect to see them. Now, I admit, when I first picked up a moth field guide, I assumed the opposite, that such fantastic beasts would never be found by mere mortals. But how wrong I was. Since starting mothing, I've seen 8 species in each of our 2 urban gardens. I'm sure you have too. So even hawk mothing starts at home, not just mothing, but hawk mothing. So we'll have a quick look at some of them. Let's celebrate them. So obviously, lime hawk moth, sure you're familiar with it, but it's long been regarded as a townie. There's a wonderful book that I recommend reading called A Moth Hunter's Gossip, written in 1937 by a publisher called PBM Allen, Philip Allen, and he designated lime hawk moth as either an aristocrat or a snob, for he invariably chooses the most fashionable parts of town. And he's absolutely right. In London, at least, it's the only moth to have turned up in my sister's patio, and she lives in the she part of London called Hampstead. But even at home, we can see, wonderful experiences and learn things through hawk moths. So my daughter and I were talking about crypsis and camouflage and the wonderful shadowy effect of these wings of this eyed hawk moth. And then we talk about the eyes itself and the purpose of the eyes, sort of startling a would-be predator, but also attracting attention towards a less important, if you like, part of the body. If a bird is going to peck it, better it pecks the hind wing than pecks the abdomen, for example. And of course, the elephant hawk moth. I mean, anyone who dismisses moths as little brown jobs, which I confess I used to do, I said that earlier, you don't need to look any further to see the light. Without a moth trap, you'd never know that the elephant hawk moths existed. You might see the caterpillars, you almost certainly wouldn't see the adults. But with a moth trap, you enter this gorgeous, brilliant, colourful new realm. And I've yet to meet a child, any of my daughter's friends, for example, who don't fall in love with this piece of winged bubblegum. But it's not just children. It was the first moth that author and naturalist Simon Barnes, sort of the best nature writer there is, properly looked at. And he equated it to a bird of paradise. So I reckon if it's good enough for Simon Barnes, it's good enough for everybody. In mid-June, which is where we are now, I took the year's first moth twitch. I don't particularly like twitching moths, but I did a bit of it in 2019. And it came at the end of a long day that was already really quite heavy with hawk moths. So I got up about 2:30 in the morning, headed over to the Norfolk coast to empty one set of traps, and then back into the Norfolk Broads to empty another set of traps. And that set of traps provided 74 different hawk moths of 5 species, I think. And while we were counting up the ides and the elephants, we heard that a Suffolk mother called Matthew Deans had just caught a striped hawk moth at a place called Bawdsey Hall, which is a wonderful setup where Matthew's got a whole range of moth traps scattered around the hall, and he surveys the moths there on a nightly basis. It's also a boutique B&B. Now, all hawk moths are exciting, but those that speak of distant climes are arguably even more so. So striped hawk moth it's a desert nomad. It's prone to these occasional demographic and distributional explosions. So after heavy winter rains down in North Africa, populations sometimes surge so that thousands may tsunami northwards into the European spring and summer. There were nearly 400 recorded in Britain in 2006, for example. But in other years, it's virtually absent. And given that 2019 might be one of those, this was a moth that I really wanted to see the moment the opportunity arises. So we headed down there and saw it. And it was amazing. It was a super moth, this epic traveller with film star looks, shaped like an arrowhead, with these enormously long wings sort of sweeping back towards its origin. But amazingly, it didn't even prove to be the very best hawk moth of the year. But you'll have to wait for the end of the talk for what was even better. Okay, clear wings. May Day was my birthday, and I spent it trying to deceive the duplicitous. So 1st of May, pretty much too early to really realistically encounter any of the 15 species of clearwing moth that we've got. But it was my birthday, and so perhaps Buxton Heath in Norfolk might provide a gift during a spot of afternoon dangling, which is what I call trying to persuade a male moth that I'm a female of his species, i.e. hanging out a pheromone lure. I'm sure you're familiar with clearwings, light bee hawk moths. They're Batesian mimics. They tend to fall into one of 3 camps, basically black and yellow striped, black with a red stripe, or hornet-like, so species that really up the ante by mimicking hornets. And what I love about clearwings is that their deceptive capabilities, they're not just about appearance, they're also about behavior. So, you know, clearwings hovering like wasps, twitching their antennae in quite an unmoth-like fashion. And the 2 hornets, I don't know if you ever caught one in a net, but they buzz furiously as well. And that prompted none other than Vladimir Nabokov, you know, celebrated lepidopterist, to laud clearwings for having what he said was mimetic subtlety far in excess of the predator's power of appreciation. Now, I'm sure you know, this century finding clearwings has become so much easier thanks to the commercial availability of pheromone lures. And that's really helped mothers survey new areas for the species. We're not reliant on trying to find the feeding signs of caterpillars, larvae, for example. And this has really revolutionized the collective understanding of clearwing distribution. But I stand back a while, and particularly if you've not done it before, it really is a bizarre pastime, isn't it? You're staring at this bung, waiting for something to happen. You've no idea really if there's actually anything impregnated in that bung or whether someone's taken you for a ride. And you're staring, and it's somewhat mesmeric. I mean, first to the point of being perhaps meditative, but then eventually to the cusp of madness, until it works. And the first time a clearwing lure comes good, it's like sorcery. I mean, it really is, isn't it? So on this heathland in North Norfolk, my nominal quarry of the 1st of May is large red-belted clearwing, the earliest clearwing to emerge each year. It's one of 3 British species, I think, whose range seems to be dwindling despite all the effort going into serving it. And personally, it's a moth nemesis for me. Twice I've glimpsed it, twice it's evaporated before I could either focus my camera or swish my net. But this time, and within just 30 seconds, I succeed. And I sprint off, I'm not ashamed to mention it, I sprinted off on a victory lap, fist pumping and yelling for joy. It was the earliest ever large red-belted clearwing in Norfolk. It was the first, as far as I'm aware, recorded anywhere in Britain that year. So it was a perfect birthday present. And I sort of repeated the same thing, the year's first record anywhere in Britain, with Welsh clearwing, and saw it with a bunch of merry men in Sherwood Forest. So it was really quite a wonderful convivial experience. So it may become clear that, you know, now, rather like Nabokov, I'm quite captivated by clearwings. And indeed, I have been since seeing my first in 2016. When I started mothing, these sort of takes on waspishness were, you know, rather like hawk moths. They were mythical creatures of wonder. They were unattainable. They were untenable. They were just pictures in a field guide. But one evening, sat at home flicking through the field guide, I realised that the ecological needs of one species, red-belted clearwing, were actually met in my own garden by dint of 2 antique apple trees. And at the time, to think of this possibility of this species occurring in my garden was a stab in the dark, because there were just 5 records in the whole of Norfolk across the previous 4 summers, so only marginally more than 1 per year. But I hung out my garden, a pheromone lure for the species in my garden, and it worked within 5 minutes. And the catch prompted the first moth twitch to my garden, with 10 happy people sipping a cup of tea, admiring their first clearing as well, who absolutely fell off their chairs with astonishment when this thing flew in, a hornet moth. Because I put out a hornet moth lure as well. I thought, if I can catch a red-belted clearing, why not try a hornet moth? It's never going to happen. Oh my God, it has. So since 2016, in Norfolk at least, there's been a huge uptick in the number of clearing records in the county. So red-belted clearing has now been recorded in many Norwich gardens, whereas mine was basically the first, as far as I'm aware. And this is one of the joys of getting into moths, a joy that you will appreciate, but which I try and convey to non-mothers, is that we can so easily contribute to knowledge in a way that's difficult with some other tasks. So birds, for example, I can contribute far more to knowledge about moths than I can ever hope to do with birds, but also that we've still got so much to learn about these quite wonderful insects. Now, 5 years ago now, I think, yeah, probably slightly less than 4 years ago, I was told off by my friend and wingman Will Saw for being sizist. He said, "You're sizist, James." And I kept on passing him these egg trays that were dusted with these tiny irrelevant specks of life that were called micromoths. And micros just weren't my thing at all. They were too small to see, too difficult to tell apart. They seemed to have these exclusively Latin names that were longer than the actual moths, and life was just too short for micros. But Will said, moths are moths are moths. And you can see that by the allocation of moth families into macro and micro Lepidoptera. It's artificial, it's arbitrary. This graphic sort of shows that with the different colours, the orange and the green sort of scattered around everywhere. It just doesn't quite work. I mean, obviously macros tend to be bigger than micros, but we all know some rather large micros, goat moth, for example, and there's the burnets and the clearwings that are treated as honorary macro moths as well, but are actually supersized micros. And over time, my frosty attitude started to thaw, and it helped that I caught a micro moth new to Norfolk in my garden one autumn, something I could never hope of doing with birds, for example. And I also realised that fun-sized moths could be real lookers. I mean, this one, it's wearing these big black sunglasses. It's boasting this great mass of straggly black hair, and it's wearing this wonderful heliotrope-dotted glam rock golden cloak. This is a 1970s rock star, surely. And then you got the disco dancing Adelareo morellas, so the green longhorns, clouds of males lecking together to attract females. The moth madness of water veneers, of course. Mayflies of the moth world, living as adults just for a few hours, mating and dying, having kind of most of their life underwater. Absolutely madness. And there's also, weird stuff as well, mad stories. So how on earth this New Zealand moth got to Britain? Well, actually, probably through importation with plant imports. But how surprising that is. And then stories that micromoths can tell. So the genus Eponomuta, which does a mean trick of sort of using ultrasound to jam bats' radars, despite not being able to hear it itself. So I, began to appreciate that Will was right. These micromoths really did have something. So as that big moth year clunk into gear, I made 2 resolutions. Number 1, treat all moths as equals. Hurrah! And more importantly, handpick a quartet of glorious must-see micros to track down and then to tell the stories of. And the first target, I'm sure you can guess what this is, first target was called Jeff. Now, Jeff isn't really Jeff, he's Alabonia jeffrella, but you, I, and everybody else will revere him and her as Jeff. Jeff is a supermodel on the micromoth catwalk. He's relatively, common and widespread across England and Wales and the south at least. But he's a glitter ball that feels attainable. He's haute couture, he's beautiful, but he's available on the high street, not Primark, probably something Topshop or a bit more than that, Next perhaps. Now, Jeff normally basks in hedgerows on the woodland edge in scrub in late May and June. This is a morning creature powered by the first rays of sun. But my first 7 attempts to find Jeff at dawn were entirely unsuccessful. But finally, an hour after first light in a Dorset woodland, in a shard of light perforating the canopy, sounds very romantic, and it almost was, I glimpsed floating gold dust. And there were a dozen male Alabonia jeffrellas dancing together above the shady, tangled brambles. And with my eye now in, I began to encounter Jeff everywhere, even without looking for him. So he demanded my attention in a shady Kent woodland, by a random lay-by on a Norfolk dual carriageway, on a pavement flanking hedge on the outskirts of Norwich. And I watched Jeff flying at all times of the day, not just in early morning. And I realised that Jeff is the micromoth that I've been waiting for, the one that would make me rethink my approach. Now, as spring morphed into summer, we tracked down other micromoth targets. One was Ovicophora bractella, same sort of thing as Jeff, if you like. And this was in large tracts of old woodland in the Wye Valley. And it finally flitted into our traps just before dawn after we'd been up all night. If I'd actually bothered to read the book, I'd have seen it, basically that's when it flies. It flies just before dawn, and I'd have gone to bed a lot earlier and had some rest. But as it was, I stayed up all night and saw it come in just before dawn. And then there's the neon striped fireball, that's Bisigna procerella, first recorded in Britain back in the famous drought year of 1976, and still known from relatively few sites in Kent and East Sussex. But 29 proved a really good year for the species, and we found several at various Kent localities. A real treat beyond belief. Meanwhile, with Cyanida dentalis, this is one of those moths that cannot possibly be real. It's not got the paroxysm of colour of Jeff or Bractella or Bisigna, but the dentalis riot, if you like, it encompasses pattern. There's this complicated interplay of cream, tan and chocolate spikes and bristles that creates this wonderful magic eye effect, optical illusion, if you like, that denies the very presence of invertebrate. This is not a moth, it says, but a grass seed, or a miniature wheatchief, or a teeny tiny hedgehog. Anyway, along coastal chalk and limestone sea cliffs, I eventually caught 100 during the year, somewhere between Kent and Dorset. And by rights, that should be wrapped. 4 exquisite micromoths, successfully researched, tracked down, admired, eulogized, released, and then about to be written about. But my plans made no account for 2019's most dazzling moth find, the rediscovery in Britain of this creature, Hypercalia citrinalis. It'd been extinct in Britain in the 1970s. Its only outpost in the British Isles, restricted to the Burren and the island. It was gone. But in 2019, it was found alive and well by a botanist on a chalk escarpment in Kent. And this was a glorious micromoth that was hiding in plain sight. So on wonderful July evening, I caught up with its garish red and yellow sweetness, which sort of screams icky E numbers, but more importantly, also hollered about how little we know about British wildlife. This was a moth that was hiding in clear sight. It wasn't extinct at all. More importantly, from a personal perspective, it was a wonder, it was a gorgeous, and it was tiny. And so it taught me a huge amount about how we perceive moths. Okay, quite unlike Kent's chalk downlands, freshwater wetlands tend not to reveal anything of their moths by day. So interrogating the habitat's a task for bright lights on overcast, cloud-comforted nights that sort of offset the inherent chill of open water. So I spent quite a large number of nights and early mornings in the Norfolk Broads in particular, getting to grips with its specialities, exploring new areas, trying to find a species such as white-mantled wainscot in a new site, for example, and heading out with veteran mothers, so a blaspheming RSPB warden, very well known in these parts. He's also an erstwhile Cockney. He's called Mick Court. And with these people, with these friends, we catch, dotted footmen and small dotted footmen. Small dotted footmen, remarkably, it was just one of only 4 resident larger moths that the really quite talented Victorians managed not to discover. So they found basically every macro moth breeding in Britain at the time, apart from 4, which this was 4. And 2019 was a really interesting summer for this species. It was found at a lot of localities away from its core area, suggesting it may be in the process of expanding its range. We catch plenty of reed leopards, a moth whose scarcity is only surpassed by its physical sexiness. It's sort of, okay, it's the colour and texture of a dried leaf reed stem, but it's got this wonderful furry shawl, and it sprawls those forelegs forward, as might its namesake feline. But it's got these amazingly long, peculiarly rounded wings that retreat backwards interminably, and yet still this preposterously lengthy abdomen somehow still protrudes beyond them, rather like a thumb tip beyond a plaster. This is where that Cockney Mick Court comes in, because he caught one. He said, "How can you have a body like that, James? I mean, What's the bloody point? I apologise for swearing. It was Mick, not me. Sorry, I would never use such words, of course. Wetlands, not just about Norfolk Broads, of course, although they are juxtaposed with where I live, but well to the west of the Broads lies the remnants of what were once truly wild waters, the fens. There's only 1%, I think, left of the original expanse. This is sort of Britain's answer to the Danube Delta, but following 2 centuries of drainage, the whole region was destroyed, sort of reinvented as England's breadbasket. Great, hey, we can eat bread, but we can't have moths and butterflies. So draining the fens was probably the single most dramatic cause of extinction of moths in Britain. And we'll never know for sure quite how bounteous fen and Lepidoptera were. So, because by the time the Victorians got there with their moth-trapping paraphernalia of sugar and paraffin lamps, they barely had time to catalogue the species that were there before they went extinct. So many lines, red tussock, gypsy moth, arash, marsh dagger, all among the species that joined the ranks of Britain's disappeared. So to honour their passing, I pledged to track down some of the fenland survivors, even if doing so means travelling slightly outside that single remaining percentile of habitat. In Cambridgeshire, I see the wonderful day-flying moth that is silver barred, really quite a lovely and locally common moth, but otherwise very, very rare indeed. Near Peterborough, I find the concolorus. I go trapping and surveying for the concolorus, far more attractive than the nickname suggests. But probably the most exciting of these wetland moths was quite a capricious rarity, called the marsh moth. It was a great prize even for the Victorian collectors, suggesting that it's always been scarce. Now, drainage extinguished marsh moth from fenland in the 1960s, but before it could be declared extinct, it was unearthed in Lincolnshire. And here it clings on today, albeit at just 2 coastal reserves, and it's endangered at national level. So we helped out with the annual Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust Spring Survey of adults. And in a year-long quest to see all these rare, remarkable moths, it's not easy. Failure constantly whispers its imminence. It could be bad weather, early flight season, late emergence, inept choice of trapping site, elusive species, all come together to render the task at best uncertain. So when we arrived in Lincolnshire to a gale force wind on a cold May evening, we really weren't optimistic. But boy, did we succeed. We caught 10 males, and I admit they're understated creatures. They're never going to set my daughter's world alight, but for you and me, I mean, they're very much a mother's moth. But not just that, catching 10 males was great, but we spotted 3 males running around in a circle in one tiny area. And this led us to discover a female. And this was actually quite big news. It was only the 2nd confirmed record of its gender in Britain, the last being back in 1948. So we took the first modern photographs of a live female in Britain. And even better, the Wildlife Trust's careful handling of the female produced 25 caterpillars that were used to try and establish a 3rd colony. So it just shows that little steps could really help. So it was something that touched me a lot. So I've written a couple of pieces about it, sort of the proper write-up in a Tropos magazine, and then a sort of more popularist account in BBC Wildlife magazine. Now, that sort of unforeseen female marsh moth aside, for many of the year's ventures, the anticipation is about what I would call known unknowns. Think back to the Iraq War for the terminology. We know that our target moth lives here, so it will not be a revelation to see it. The tenterhooks instead emanate from the unknowns of whether it has emerged and whether it will enter our traps or our nets in whatever conditions greet us on the precise evening we visit. But nevertheless, we travel to a site with a sense of, if not exactly entitlement, then certainly expectation. But there is none of that with this species, the marsh carpet. In its adult form, at least, it's a moth of unknown unknowns. It once united the 2 great damp regions of East Anglia, fenland and the Broads, but disappeared entirely in the 1940s, feared extinct. And even now, it sort of remains fickle to the point of unpredictability, thriving at a site briefly before disappearing inexplicably, irrevocably. And that rarity and that disappearance really are inexplicable because the larval flue plant, which is common meadowrue, grows over a large area of the country. So there should be potential habitat for it anywhere. And Norfolk presumably remains a stronghold. It's convenient because that's where I live. But for the first decade of this century, produced just 5 records. So when I was asking experienced mothers around the place where I should try and see marsh carpet, everyone shrugged. Nobody knew. So I tried something very different indeed, and that was to try and help Sharon Hurl of BC in the east of England in her efforts to conserve the moth. So I compiled recent records of marsh carpet from garden moth traps around Norwich. Triangulating the catches, I pinpointed a promising stretch of damp meadows alongside the River Wensum in the northwest of the city, just conveniently only a mile from my home. And the trail led to a fish farm that was managed by the Environment Agency. And through a friend, I learned that the food plant, called meadowroo, grew there. So I started to get really quite excited. And after much toing and froing and much on and offing and permission seeking and all the rest of it, we hooked up with officials from the Environment Agency and from Natural England. And unbelievably, we caught 3 adult marsh carpets, 1 in a trap and 2 on the lit windows of an outbuilding. As far as I'm aware, nobody's caught more than 3 in a night before. I may be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, and also as far as I'm aware, these were the only 3 adults caught anywhere in Britain during 2019. And this moth is absolutely glorious. It's this wonderfully gently curved piece of fudge with this strip of licorice running through it. And against all possible odds, all conceivable odds, it seems that we found a wholly new breeding site for one of Britain's rarest and most poorly understood moths. And that discovery has hopefully set in a bit of a relationship between Sharon Hurl and the Environment Agency. They've certainly been in contact about how to manage the site better for the moth. And it just shows that, you know, even amateur moths trying something different can potentially help in a small way towards conservation. Now, woodlands, sort of more than any other landscape, I think, mothing in forests demands going out at night. It's only during the inky hours that woodlands reveal their innermost secrets, creatures that shun daylight every bit as much as a vampire. And among trees, the other world of night is sort of where the wildest things appear, where trunks become shadows, become monsters. But this timetabling presents problems, for me at least, because woodland mothing requires, you know, turning your daily routine upside down. I'm someone who typically rises at dawn and beds down at dusk, but after some, you know, some learning, if you like, some practice, it's at night in this sylvan realm that I learned to feel the most alive. And these are some of the most treasured nights of my entire year. We're in a whole series of forests. The first of which was helping out with a wonderful butterfly conservation-led project funded by Back from the Brink, looking at Barbary carpets. And normally Barbary carpets are surveyed by counting larvae. But we were there just as it was worked out that actually serving for adults by night with lights is a good thing as well. And we caught 17 moths, I think, in our survey there, which is more than anyone else, Fiona had said, that caught in the night for years. Among other locations, we survey moths in the world famous ecological laboratory of Whiteton Woods near Oxford. And obviously this is particularly poignant now because we did so with the late, I'm not ashamed to say it, great Doug Boys, sadly taken from us too soon. He was laid to rest yesterday. His celebration of his life is tomorrow. I'm sure many of you had the opportunity to meet Doug either in person or virtually. He was a genius. He was a legend. He was an inspiration. I learned so much from him. I enjoyed the time I spent with him hugely. His departure is awful, beyond words. But the talk goes on. So other woodlands we visited, Whiteton Woods, I've just spoken about. The Wye Valley was where we successfully targeted scarce hooktip, a local lime-loving specialist, and a real stunner as well. I love hooktips. I think they're gorgeous creatures. But we also spent several nights in the depths of Alston Forest in Kent, one of the best moth sites in Britain, surely. Apparently overlooked by the Victorians, but its potential was only sort of recognised by local mothers during the 1930s, coming to prominence for an array of rare breeders found nowhere else in Britain, some of which have sadly vanished already. Lesser Bale, Lunar Double Stripe among them, many remain. And on one particular night, I recalled, the forest was absolutely alive. It was the most intense night of nothing I'd experienced at that point. Assaulted by chaos, we trapped 3,000 individuals by dawn in our traps. We reckon another 3,000 were around on the sheets outside, or attracted to the lights but never actually reached the trap, sort of blizzarding around our faces, alighting on our shirts, littering those ground sheets. Unbelievable. And every trap round sort of, picked up something really quite exciting. We ended up with around about 200 species, which at the time was a phenomenal diversity for me. Their number included great oak beauties, sort of a near mythical deep forest species, for which, really quite surprisingly, for such a well-studied site, we provided the first confirmed records in Alston Forest. But also classics of this area, such as Scarce Merveille du Jour. I mean, what a wonderful lichen-rich creature. But also, micromoths that were intriguing too. So Agriptera nemiralis seems to be doing really well, having been thought quite close to extinction 20 odd years ago. It wasn't even in Alston until 5 years ago. Now it's a firm site for the species, and we caught 30 on just one night. And that number absolutely took our breath away, because we'd have been happy, over the moon indeed, just to have caught one. A few weeks later, we find that a similar kind of range expansion is happening with dark crimson underwings. It's recorded at several sites across the Alston Forest, and we find at least one new breeding site for it. And it turns out there's been an influx from the Low Countries, and it's now been sort of pushing from southeast England, sort of recapturing some of the old haunts, separate from the New Forest population, and it's now breeding quite routinely in Norfolk and around Norwich, for example. Haven't had it in my garden yet, but most people around here have. And it gives us a chance to give the moth a bit of reward by having some lovely sugar solution as well. And nearby woodland near Alston, a secret site, we join a Folkestone mother called Ian Roberts, with whom we survey a population of dusky hooktip. This is an interesting species because it's only just started breeding in Britain in 2017, and things really do change fast in the world of moths. So since 1900, I think Mark Parsons reckons we've gained somewhere near 140 colonists. Most of those have been since 1990. Arrival sort of expedited by climate change, horticultural trade, and that's good news. But there's a really unsavoury side to the moth balance sheet in Britain, and this is another graphic and data from the BC publication that Rich was so involved with. Perhaps 50 species have now gone extinct here. Moreover, roughly 1 in 8 resident larger moths, more than 100 species, is categorized now as near threatened or nationally threatened or near threatened. And for species where long-term abundance trends could be worked out by BC, roughly 4 times as many are declining as they're increasing. And in Britain, headline figure, 1/3 fewer moths airborne now than 50 years ago. This is a real, this is really worrying stuff. And even before this came out, the worrying state of affairs that so alarmed a composer called Harrison Birtwistle. They wrote a piece of music called The Moth Requiem, where voices sort of forlornly incant the Latin names of moths past. I really think he needs to do it again, because there's a lot more that seem to be going as well. Okay, time for something different. Late June, time to execute an audacious Highland heist, if you like, the year's riskiest trip, heading up to West Scotland. And the quarry here is a trio of restricted range look-alike day-flying moths that are respectively rare, very rare, and obscenely rare. So seeing them as a major undertaking, and not only that, but our dates are suboptimal and they're fixed, and we're going to need sun, and that's not at all sure thing in Scotland. So to succeed, everything has to go right on the 3 days that we've got available, 1 per species. I'm talking about burnet moths, obviously, and our quest for transparent New Forest and slender Scotch. I mean, it's clearly not a sane quest, is it? But that's the allure of the rare. So humans crave rare things because they allow us to distinguish ourselves from other people. I own a Matisse, and so that makes me richer, more powerful, and worthier than you. But there are downsides. So John Fowles, the author, argues that rarity chasing is a form of destroying. Although what is destroyed may be less the rarities themselves, he says, than the vain and narrow-minded fool who devotes all his time to their pursuit. So I'm very much aware of this, as our Burnet saga starts at 5 a.m. on day one in Norwich, when we first travel west to look for Silky Wave and survey Silky Wave in the Avon Gorge, before trapping all night in the Wye Valley for scarce hooktip and bractella, as I talked about earlier. And we have no sleep, so on day two we drive 8 hours north straight up to Oban in Argyll, drawing up at 6 o'clock in the evening. And even in Argyll's, this is our route, you know, a nonsensical route if you like, even in Argyll's first sun for 2 days, 6 o'clock in the evening is pretty late to start climbing uphill and searching for a day-flying moth such as transparent burnet, particularly when the information we were using was nearly a decade old. Anyhow, we traipsed up recently felled switchbacks, sort of embalmed in sweat amidst this sort of unexpected warmth, and then we parted company with the trail and we struck out over undulating heathery grassland, and we checked several sets of coordinates without luck, and the weather is now hardening, and the longer we search forlornly, the bolder dusk becomes, further corroding our chances. And we reach a final set of waypoints, but here we immediately notice the difference. There's a skirt of scree which suggests unstable steep slopes, and that leads us to a cricket pitch strip of flat ground, the vegetation buzz-cut short and full of wild thyme. And this is where we find our quarry. Transparent burnet are absolutely sumptuous. They've got this wonderful fluffy black head that trails backwards, rather like a 1970s mullet, and rumples forward onto the underside of the thorax to form this snug onesie. And sort of crimson leeches across 3/4 of those wings, with only a broad fringe to be acquired by burnished blackness. And we count 15 individuals crammed into a rectile, which is basically no more than 30 meters in area. And our visit seems to have coincided with the very start of this tiny colony's adult existence. We really couldn't have timed our visit better. The following day, we meet up with legendary mother. He spends quite a lot of time at Proul Point in Devon, called Dave Grundy, and with Dave, Tom Prescott of BC Scotland has granted us quite privileged access to the only site in Britain for New Forest burnet. It's a clandestine location, visits normally prohibited. And 35 years after the species went extinct in the south of England as a result of habitat degradation and exhaustive collecting, New Forest burnet was discovered quite unexpectedly here in 1963. And at the very least, we think, even if we don't find the moth, it's still pretty early in the season for it, we'll witness the quite heroic conservation efforts that BC Scotland has been leading to save this moth from national extinction. And there's no doubt we will be lucky to see it. It's a week or two early for the flight season, but the sun is shining. And after a long walk over footpathless rough ground, we reach a sea cliff. We pass through 2 quite imposing anti-sheep fences installed by BC Scotland to prevent sheep munching the habitat that the burnets need. And finally, we reach hallowed ground, a sort of scallop of steeply sloping cliff edge grassland, barely more than a hectare in total. And it's a tiny area to sort of house the entire national population of a species. Yet paradoxically, it's also a huge realm to search for a moth the length of my fingernail. It feels like it's a needle in haystack time. And yet within 5 meters we succeed. We collapse in absolute kneeling reverence as a New Forest burnet uncurls its helter-skelter proboscis and exerts it into the nectar font of a thyme flower. And it appears utterly unperturbed by our admiration. It's dinkier than the other burnets. It's got these clearly circumscribed carmine spots. There's an ink pad texture to its blackness, hints of sheeny blue in there as well. And in total, we estimate perhaps 50 New Forest burnets emblazoning pockets of this wonderful coastal cliff slope, and all are fresh, and they've clearly just emerged, and our timing again has proved impeccable. To claim the burnet Triple Crown, we need to cross to the Isle of Mull. So slender Scotch burnet now lives at just 5 sites there, plus one on the islet of Ulva, and invasive cotoneasters are damaging several of those. But nevertheless, we arrive in perfect conditions, and we're pretty confident as we're yomping downhill towards the the upstanding rocky protrusion, one of these basalt plugs that's sort of flecked with time and bird's foot trefoil, which is where Dave Grundy reckoned we should search. And once we got our eye in, we realised it took us a while to realise that slender Scotch burnet's really quite much smaller than the more familiar 6-spot burnets. We find our wee quarry everywhere, and we count a quite astonishing 537 individuals on and around the basalt plug. It's hard to imagine anyone ever counting so many. I'm sure they have, but it's hard to imagine it. We couldn't conceive of it. And slender Scotch burnet, if you like, is sort of midway between transparent and New Forest burnets in appearance, normally 6 red spots on the wing, but the outermost 2 fused to form a sort of kidney-like mark, and the foremost swishes forward to swishes backwards rather into a point, as if yearning to imitate a transparent. Now, black at the cafe at Glengorm, we learnt unexpectedly of another insidious threat. A ranger came up to my friend Will, having spotted his sweet net, and it's quite alarmed by Will's net, and started interrogating him about his motives. Have we come to steal the burnets? Now, we were aware that 2 collectors were once apprehended by police with hundreds of slender Scotch burnets in their van. But we were there innocently, so Will explained our honourable intentions to watch, to count, to submit our records, to admire. And the ranger obviously was satisfied, but did caution that clandestine collecting can still occur and can still threaten this particular moth. And it was a real revelation to us that moth rustling, if you like, remains a danger for this species as well as the New Forest burnet. And it really chastened us. I think when human pursuit of the rare deprives a creature of its right to exist, it's surely time to stop. And we have to stop too in this particular expedition, but for a different reason. Our time is up. With a few more days, we might have tried to wrap up Britain's burnets, the clean sweep, if you like, by seeing Talisker and mountain burnets elsewhere in Scotland. But I have to admit, not seeing them doesn't bother me quite as much as I thought it would. I discovered that I lack the completer finisher streak that marks out true obsessives. And for me, the allure of the rare is not about marking myself out from others. The excitement instead lies in its novelty. I don't know what to expect. And it also lies in the thrill of the chase, to freight hopping uncertainty and accepting the prospect of failure. But above all, I learned that my pursuit of these rarities is about the entire experience. All these moths may look the same, but the settings in which we see them, the conservation efforts they've inspired, and the stories that they encant are equally defined by their differences. Each very much is to its own. So it's just gone 6 o'clock on an early August morning, and I'm packing up after another night's mothing on the RSPB reserve at Dungeness, and it's really quite early unsociably early indeed, for my phone to start beeping, which makes my mind yo-yo between disaster and elation. But the accompanying the message that I received from a Dungeness mother called Owen, and the accompanying photograph, basically made me realise it's something good. So the image discloses this boldly patterned moth. I've not seen one before, but I know precisely what it is. Owen is called Tamaris peacock. It's very rare, and it's not from around here. It's a winged wanderer from foreign lands. It's, I think, the 20th ever recorded in Britain, and it's all about, this part of the talk and this part of the book is all about migrant moths. You're very well placed in Devon for migrant moths. I'm not so well placed in Norfolk. But moth migration overall is both a wonder and a mystery of the natural world, that fragile creatures such as moths can fly such distances, often over an open water. I find it really astounding. So it follows for many mothers, catching migrants provides the most thrilling dimension of their hobby, because migrant mothing is very much the art of the possible. In optimum conditions, anything could turn up pretty much anywhere. And if opening your garden moth trap makes you feel like a child on Christmas Day, that's what mine does every time, running traps at a site that's famed for migrants is like all those Christmases coming at once. So I spent a whole host of nights trapping suitable migrant locations in Norfolk and Suffolk, in Kent, in Dorset, in Devon, in Cornwall. I help out on National Moth Night out at Bawdsey Hall, where there's a public event there organised by Matthew Deans, who's here on the left. And we see plenty of migrant moths thanks to these efforts and those of local mothers. Some we catch ourselves, most indeed. Others we see in pots. Some are common migrants, diamondbacks, silver wise. Who can forget the vast number of silver wise swarming around the Paris stadium in Euro 2016 football final, stopping play or postponing the start of the play, and even landing on Cristiano Ronaldo's eyebrow. And we saw some really rare moths, superbly rare moths, very exciting indeed. But there's one moth that I'm after in particular. It's not quite as rare as these on this page. It's the convolvulus hawk moth. It drives me around the bend because I keep on encountering it in other people's traps and never my own. And you know what I'm talking about. You want to catch the species yourself. You don't want to go and twitch it and somewhere else. And people have asked me advice on where to try and how to do it. Some people suggest leaving your washing out overnight because it seems you've got a fetish for landing on clothing. But again, I try this and I fail. It just doesn't work. But eventually I succeed in a quarry on the east side of Portland in Dorset, catching one after a massive storm that hailed from Africa which gullied paths into Flashford rivers. And I punched the air because catching this particular moth was every bit as scintillating as I hoped, and I lose myself in the black water pools of its eyes and taking every stripe, line and blemish on its amazing wings, and I feel I am complete. But as we dismantle the traps and lug them up slope to their car, I feel bone weary. I wasn't, feeling as well as that smile on that face suggests. And exhausted by the elation of finally trapping my target, I need sleep more than ever. But I don't get it, because once I get back to the road, I re-enter mobile phone reception and I notice an email come in from a Dorset mother called Chris Fox, who we'd met 2 evenings previously. And the matter-of-fact title alone made my knees buckle. It said, Oleander hawk moth. And when I read the email, which is what you're reading there, my world stopped breathing. I mean, Oleander hawk moth, it's peerless. It's a master migrant. It's probably come 1,500 miles from tropical Africa to reach Chris's farm in North Dorset. It's huge. It rivals my mobile phone for size. I think I've got a pic in a minute. It's placid, even plasticine. And it's a rarity indeed, because of the 120 odd British records, a load of them were in the first half of the 20th century. So it's quite a rare species nowadays. Now, back at Dungeness in August, I made a big decision. I was going to resist pot twitching wherever possible, unless it's an Oleander hawk moth or something like that. So as an exception to the rule, it was quite a fortunate moth to specify, if you like. So we gave up on the idea of sleep and we headed home via North Dorset. And when we arrive, we're greeted by this. So rather incongruously, that the moth's being shaded and confined with an ice cream tub because Chris hasn't got a pot big enough to house it. He removes the tub. And I know you've seen it now, but you gasp, don't you? I mean, irrepressibly patterned. There's almost lysergic swirls giddy me. My eyes career forwards to this creature's head before turning to the outer edge of the upwing, at the very front of which there's this dark pupilled pseudo eye staring angrily at me. And the colours, meanwhile, sort of make this moth sort of otherworldly. A violet bruise pours into olive, rose twists into apple green. The antennae are lemon, those evil would-be eyes are orange. Yes, those eyes. There's sort of an insidious malevolence to this beast's beauty. It's a not so jolly green giant. It's a witch doctor in invertebrate form. It's a bad trip, but it's addictive too, and I can't wrench my eyes away. And it's the story of this big moth year, this pursuit of Britain's rare, remarkable moths in one single glorious animal. Now, we've gone over an hour, so time decrees that I'm going to have to end the tale there, which is a shame because, with another hour, I could have talked to you about searches for the early stages of moth's life, from vaporer eggs to lunar yellow underwing caterpillars, surveying those with my bum in the air, to the larval cases of Eudacia richardsoni on the Dorset cliff, to a triumph of hibernating heralds in the Derbyshire tunnel. Or we could have talked about the searching for the special day-flying moths of dry areas such as the Brecks and Hertfordshire's arable belt and Kent's chalk downland. Or indeed Could have talked about the remarkable lacking behaviour of ghost moths, the willow wisping on a meadow besides a friend's garden, and all the other summer garden treats that my daughter and I enjoy. And sadly, we don't even have time for a night or 10 on the beach, whether in Norfolk looking for moths that speak of the strand line, like the scarce pug, or the sand dart, or the shorn waistcock, or in the salt marsh of Bawdsey Keith, the remarkable sandhill rostock. This is a moth that is capable as an adult of swimming underwater. Or visiting a pebbly wasteland in Kent where local mother Nigel Jarman is trying to save a moth called the Bright Wave, or visiting the shingle fulcrum of Dungeness for a raft of specialities such as the two on the right-hand side, Scots Scarce Chocolate Tip and Sussex Emerald. I also go on the trail of Victorian Lepidopterists in rock-rich areas such as Portland, the Avon Gorge, North Wales, seeking a trio of waves amongst others, so Portland Ribbon, Silky Wave and Weaver's Wave. There's also a chapter on heathland moths, which starred an attempt to rediscover the speckled footman, which at the time was feared plausibly extinct. We don't even have time to relate a series of fortunate encounters with the rare, the remarkable, the massive Clifton nonpareil. For decades, the most fervently desired moth of them all, which is, as I'm sure you know, is in the throes of recolonising Britain after an extended absence. Isn't its recolonisation so remarkable? I've even had one in my Norwich garden now. After a handful of records in Norfolk this century, there's been 60 or something this year. It's absolutely amazing. And nor can I talk to you about efforts to survey marshmallow moth in Kent, Fisher's estuarine moth in Essex and Kent, southern chestnut and sombre brocade in Dorset, or indeed to search for black-spotted chestnut in Kent. And black-spotted chestnut, that one at the bottom there, may not be a looker, but it was our final target moth of the year. And it was both special in itself, because it's colonised England only in the last decade, and it's so sort of symbolic of the changes that are happening to our moth fauna, but also, and this is so personally resonant, because I saw it in the garden of the man who trapped Britain's second ever record, but the very same man, James Hunter, who introduced me to moths through that inaugural Poplar hawk moth 7 years earlier. And this is the thing about moths, and you'll know this far more than me. There's never an end to the wonders that they afford, no conclusion to issues with their conservation, no bounds to our understanding of their status, distribution or ecology. There's so much to talk about, so much to investigate, so much to help conserve, so much that we can all do. And that means, as I hope I've shown, that there is truly and inarguably much ado about mothing. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some of the highlights of a quite amazingly intense year with you all. I hope they've brought back some fond memories of moths that you have seen or moths that you would like to see. And I'll now hand you back to Richard